Okay, here we go with a lecture on social constructionism, which is sort of going to be the core for a lot of what we talk about in this course. Um, and so the two big examples I'm going to go through, well, the one I'm going to go through in more detail is the so-called super predator hypothesis. And there's a link. You can go to the New York Times website. Actually, they have a bunch of stuff on here you could use for this. It's kind of they have a thing they did a few years back where they went back and dug up old news stories and said, like, how do we look back on them in time? And so how do we 20 years later when we look back, was it just a panic over nothing, or did it turn out to be something that was important? Um, and so one of them is the so-called super predator hypothesis, and then the paper for this topic is on MAD. So I'm going to give you kind of a setup, but not go through all the detail. I want you to read the article and sort of see what you can get out of it based on what we talk about. So the starting point is to sort of think about how we know everything we know, right? So everything you know to be true about the world, in part we experience some things in the world, and that so we understand that stoves are hot because we touch them and they burn our finger. But most of us had parents who said, "Don't touch the stove, hot, owie." And so that's an example of the difference between symbolic reality and experience reality. Some kids are just stove touchers, though. They don't believe mom, and so they have to touch it for themselves. Most kids like playing around with fire, and most of them eventually burn themselves. So the vast majority of what we know, how do you know what material the moon is made of? How do you know the earth is actually round and not flat? On and on and on is part of our symbolic reality. It's things we've sort of picked up from parents, friends, from books, television, movies, and so obviously this sort of stuff here is media stuff. And so the media it forms a big part of our symbolic reality. This is kind of an interesting side note. There's science on this that what happens when your direct experience conflicts with what people have told you is true. And most people assume that, right? If you experience it yourself, that's going to be a lot more potent. Um, I'll give you at least two examples, and most of you can think of one yourself. My dad, who's as sarcastic and as I am, and as my kids would say, mean as I am, he was worse as a parent. But one of the things he did is he had this farmer friend that had like a 20-year-old horse that when they put it down, they ground it up in a hamburger. And everybody he talked to was like, "Oh, it's so disgusting. I would never eat horse meat," and so on and so forth. So he brought into work a big vat of chili made of this horse meat. Didn't tell anybody. So everybody ate the horse meat. "Oh, great chili, Bob. This is awesome. Thanks for bringing it in." And then he waited about 2 hours, and he told people it was the horse, this 20-year-old horse that had some big nasty growth on its neck. And two people after they found out got physically sick, puked, and had to go home. So you think about it, right? What was their direct experience? Their direct experience was chili was good. Um, when they found out it was actually horse meat, their symbolic experience was, well, we don't eat horses in the United States. Horses are animals you ride on. It's disgusting to eat them, and oh my God, and they literally physically reacted to that symbolic reality versus their experienced reality. Something similar. I have a nephew that he eats next to nothing. He subsided on like hot dogs and peanut butter sandwiches for a while. But my wife made zucchini, so some kind of zucchini cake. So it looks like chocolate cake, tastes like chocolate cake, but it has zucchini in it. And again, they didn't tell him what it was. He ate it, thought it was great. Told him he ate zucchini, and he had a conniption fit and thought it was the most horrible thing anybody could do to him. So the point here is that a good chunk of our sort of what we believe to be true about the world comes from this symbolic reality, and oftentimes that can be a lot more potent than things we directly experience ourselves. Um, the gist of social constructionism is that they have this, in some Eastern philosophies, even this isn't important, right? That some Eastern philosophies are like that there is no sort of absolute physical world, that the physical world kind of depends on your own perspective. most Westerners believe that there's an objective physical world. And then the issue is that sort of how do we construct or interpret this world? And so there are sort of moral entrepreneurs or claims makers, same word means the same thing, that put forth constructions about how the world is and why the world is like that. And in modern times, the media is one of the primary arenas where that competition over views of the world plays out. And so there's sort of two sorts of claims, which I'll get to in a bit. We're talking about now. There are factual claims and interpretive claims. Now, factual claims doesn't mean these are claims that are absolutely true. What it means is that these are claims about how the world is. So if I say, concrete is hard, if I say crime has increased in the past year, so this is how the world is. Interpretive claims would be why the world is like that. So if I say crime went up, 20% last year, and it went up because, I don't know, we had a new epidemic of some synthetic drug. The factual claim is crime went up. The interpretive claim is it went up because we had some new epidemic of some synthetic drug. And so those are the two types of claims people make. And as I said, for this class, this is why it's important that largely in modern times, these debates take place through the media. And it's critical because, the media tends to favor certain things. And it tends to be less about sort of truth and compelling evidence and more about you think about what plays well in the media. And it goes back to, like, what is the media there for? They're there to make money. And so they tend to favor things that have emotional appeal, visual appeal, and so on and so forth. This is all critical because winning social constructions have an effect on human behavior and have an effect on, ultimately, on policy that gets decided. And so they can be critically important. The sort of both sides issues and the media arena tend to mean that, the media isn't sort of a neutral playground. The media often feels compelled to sort of find an alternative voice to any opinion somebody has. So you can have sort of well-grounded scientific information, and then, well, let's go to the other guy. And somebody that's just sort of making crap up gets the same amount of airtime. And so no matter what the issue is, you have this sort of both sides mentality. And both are given equal airtime. So, and the arena part I talked about, that's that the media sort of prefers things that are emotional and appealing and so on and so forth. So prior to talking about crime, there's sort of a great example of a debate. It's still ongoing. You don't hear as much about it, but it was a big thing only a few years ago. And that is that this sort of movement by parents to not vaccinate their kids. And because of that, we've had outbreaks of measles and other things that are totally preventable. It's a good example of sort of claims makers and moral entrepreneurs and how that plays out in the media. Probably the most famous people on the sort of people critical of vaccinations are Jenny McCarthy, Jim Carrey, and some other celebrities, and some grassroots parent organizations. And on the other side, you have sort of the scientific community and doctors and the Center for Disease Control. And so when you talk about media deference to all sides, you have these media events where on one side you have scientists, and on the other side you have in Jenny McCarthy's case, a person that is famous for being a former playmate and a reality TV star. Why does that make her sort of an expert on vaccination? Well, her son, Evan, got a vaccination, and she believes that immediately after that he started showing symptoms of autism. And so it's this sort of this argument made that vaccination caused autism that led people to sort of not vaccinate their kids. And you can see, so we've got a couple clips here. And if you want to, the second clip I'll show you is a PBS. They have like an hour special on this.
Let's take a look at you and your special son, Evan. Watch.
Hi. Who's that? It's Evan. I love you more than the size of the whole sky. love you than the whole, than all the jungles.
What?
Wow, look at all the horses.
This is a beautiful horse barn, sir. Everybody watch out, here comes Gary Oscar! I love you more than all the animals on the planet.
And I love you than outer space.
Damn, is he cute?
He is.
You've shared the story before. Give us a little history of Evan and autism.
Sure. Evan was diagnosed with autism just before the age of 3. He started having seizures, was what made me lead to look for more answers. One of the seizures went into cardiac arrest. It's something that we still, have to deal with, but soon after those seizures, he was diagnosed with autism.
What'd you do about it?
Instead of, leaving it as a dead-end, diagnosis, I went online and I found a community called Defeat Autism Now. And for 12 years, thank God, this community of doctors and scientists who have been healing and treating kids with autism, I believed enough, even though my pediatrician at the time said it's all bull, and followed this treatment, and my son got better. The amazing thing is, what I want people to know first off, because a lot of things that we're going to talk about is vaccines, is that I'm not, nor is the autism community, anti-vaccine. We're anti-toxin and we're anti-schedule. But the thing is, the way I treated Evan and the way a lot of these parents are treating their kids is not treating autism.
All right, so she goes on, and you can Google this stuff on your own if you want. But what I wanted to point out is, if you look at that, you're talking about visual and compelling, right? You have this little,
instead of,
talking, this little cutout of
leaving it
her,
as a dead end.
cutting up her son's pancakes or whatever they are. Before that, you had the soft music and the very emotional. So when you talk about media wanting things that are visual and emotional, you have a physically attractive person who's a celebrity and her cute little kid, and the emotional sort of anguish of him developing autism and so on and so forth. So from a media perspective, this is great, but from a science perspective, not so much. So what's a little bit of the frontline stuff, again, this is going to be Jane McCarthy, and then sort of contrasted with what we know about the science.
Began my crusade for autism. One of the first speeches I gave was, is it Mercury? Is it the schedule? Is there just too many? My answer to people and what I've been telling them is it's all of the above. We don't know for sure, which is why we keep saying study it, but they won't.
In fact, around the world, scientists had been studying groups of children, searching for a possible link between vaccines and autism, using the same epidemiological methods that linked smoking to lung cancer. One country renowned for its epidemiology is Denmark. Unlike the U.S., Danish authorities collect demographic and health data routinely on the entire population in a series of national registers. They know when every child was born, when every child was vaccinated, and when every case of autism was diagnosed.
It's sort of a paradise for epidemiologists because we don't have to work to collect this data. It is available to us.
Anders Hvid and colleagues at the Statens Serum Institute analyzed data on all the Danish children born between 1991 and 1998, over 500,000. They compared two groups, those who had received the MMR triple shot and those who hadn't. Then they counted the cases of autism in each group and calculated the autism rate. They found no difference. Children who didn't get the shot had the same risk of developing autism as those who did. The team published the findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. Other studies carried out by researchers in Sweden, Finland, Britain, and the US also found no association between MMR and autism. Additional evidence came from Japan. The Japanese changed their vaccine schedule in 1993, replacing the MMR triple shot with 3 separate vaccinations. But following the change, autism rates did not fall. In fact, they appeared to rise, thus making the triple shot an unlikely cause of autism. The Danish team now went on to investigate the second theory, the mercury preservative thimerosal. It turned out that in Denmark, there was a simple way to test this as well.
In Denmark, since the 70s, only one vaccine has contained thimerosal, and that was a pertussis vaccine. It contained thimerosal until May-June 92. Then the same vaccine continued, but without thimerosal.
David and colleagues found that children who were given pertussis vaccines with thimerosal before 1992 had identical autism rates as children who received mercury-free vaccines after that date.
We did not find any association between being vaccinated with the thimerosal-containing vaccine and the risk of autism.
Other studies in the US, the UK, and Canada also found no association between autism and thimerosal. In 2004, the Institute of Medicine carried out its own analysis of the research and concluded,
the body of epidemiological evidence favors rejection of a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism, and also between thimerosal-containing vaccines and autism.
Just take a moment to realize how unsexy and appealing that is, even with their little guy who reads it.
The allegations against me are both unfounded.
So a little context. Part of the reason the autism vaccination thing got traction was this dude who published a scientific study of like 13 kids, and it turns out they had been, a lot of them referred to him by a lawyer who was suing the vaccine industry for the claim that their kids made their kids autistic, and ultimately they retracted his paper.
Then something extraordinary happened. On February 2nd, 2010, The Lancet retracted Wakefield's landmark 1998 paper, saying it was scientifically flawed. Scientists around the world had not been able to replicate Wakefield's findings, and it turned out that some of the kids in his small study had been referred by a lawyer who was suing pharmaceutical manufacturers on the children's behalf. But in the wake of the retraction, organizations like Generation Rescue came out in strong support of Wakefield, continuing to believe in his science. Soon after, parents of autistic children who brought class action lawsuits based on the MMR and thimerosal theories had their hopes dashed by the federal vaccine court.
And good evening to you. We begin tonight with a ruling that affects millions of parents with children who have autism. Families who went to a federal court over these vaccines were told their case was without scientific or legal merit.
The vaccine court that Barbara Loe Fisher's organization had helped set up issued a strongly worded ruling on March 12, 2010, denying a link between autism and vaccines.
Scientifically, I think the matter is settled, but I don't think that. I think there are a lot of people who don't listen to science and don't understand it, so they're going to be difficult to sway with the scientific arguments.
Don't give a about what the MMR said. My kid got 6 vaccines in one day and he regressed. You don't have any science that can show me that the regression wasn't triggered by the 6 vaccines.
So that's basically the crux of it. I mean, the issue is that kids show signs of autism around, developmentally the same time as they get these vaccines. And so if you're a parent, it's understandable that your kid gets a vaccine. You see all of a sudden all these symptoms that you assume one causes the other. But part of what's important is to give you that contrast between scientific guy trying to explain it and PBS trying to explain the science versus sort of much more visceral, emotional appeal of this guy.
What the parents are saying is, I went in for a vaccine appointment, my kid got 6 vaccines, and they regressed. We need to ask the question as to why the regression took place. Not whether the regression took place, why the regression took place. The only way to do that is to look at that load of vaccines and compare a group of kids or a group of animals who got the load and who didn't.
If you're going to do epidemiology, let's ask the right question. Let's not confine it to MMR, and let's not confine it to one component in a vaccine, mercury. You have to do bench science. You have to look at the human body and what occurs in terms of changes in immune function, brain function. You can't just do epidemiology where you're comparing groups of children against each other.
Vaccine critics say many more studies are needed before scientists can rule out side effects like autism. Studies of the other vaccines, studies of multiple additives, and studies to see if certain children are genetically predisposed to a vaccine reaction.
The hypotheses continue to shift. The first hypothesis, which, people bought into long and hard, is that the combination measles, mumps, rubella, or MMR vaccine caused autism. 12 epidemiological studies showed that that wasn't true. Then the hypothesis shifted to thimerosal, an ethylmercury-containing preservative that was in vaccines, that's no longer in vaccines, but except for some multi-dose preparations of flu vaccine, that caused autism. And that clearly has been shown not to be true. So now, and this is classic for pseudoscience, is you just keep moving the goalpost. So now the goalpost is, no, we didn't mean actually MMR caused autism or thimerosal caused autism. We just meant vaccines in general caused autism.
All right. So, again, the point, and this is just a great example of claims making that has had, and you can watch this PBS thing. Ultimately, there's now pockets of people, tend to be liberal, left-leaning people, in pockets in Colorado and Oregon where they're just refusing to vaccinate kids. Vaccination rates go down, and then you have these little outbreaks. So let's get back to the terminology part of this. So in terms of super predator, so Delio's an interesting fellow. He's actually a guy that came and talked to me when I was a graduate student that at the time I sort of didn't understand the context. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know much of what he'd written. But his little video thing there about, when they interview him later and he's like, well, we were just wrong and it's not real science and we sort of made mistakes is a bit at best disingenuous and sort of very self-serving, trying to make himself look like just a guy who made a mistake and we were all wrong. And, the reality is, you read the article, so there's a link on Moodle to this article. You read it, it's sort of this weird, curious mix of ideology and faith and science sprinkled in to try to make the story compelling. So in terms of our understanding of how things get socially constructed, right? In this case, we have Delio, who's a pretty conservative political scientist. He argued in the 80s and 90s, he was one of the people arguing to build a bunch of prisons and lock folks up. And so if you read the article, he makes a ton of claims. Most of those claims are anecdotal. Right? So what is anecdote? Anecdote is Jenny McCarthy saying Evan is my evidence. Evan is her son, right? Well, that's one person sort of telling you a story. That's an anecdote. And his article, Delio's article, is just littered with these anecdotes, right? That he starts out with this really good writer, very compelling, talking about this really tough Democratic prosecutor from Philly, and she's scared, and because she's scared, we should all be scared. And these stories that she tells about these big beefy guys, big Philly dudes, and they're afraid of their kids, kids whose voices have yet to change, and they pack guns instead of lunches, and so on and so forth. And that they're coming to get you. They're coming up to the suburbs in the rural heartland. Veteran cops have to say Hail Mary now before they go to calls about juveniles because they're afraid. You have inmates in prisons, these tough inmates that are afraid of kids. And you have Delio himself talking about, and he did studies on prisons. That's one of the ways he got famous. That, he's fine going to supermax prisons full of rapists and murderers and examining scenes of riots and homicides in prison. But there's no way he's going to do research anymore in juvenile facilities full of impulsive violence, vacant stares. Oh my God, there's like 3 spelling errors in this. Vacant stares, smiles. I'm going to fix this. Uh-oh. I'm not going to fix it until I do that. My apologies for wasting your time. And remorseless eyes. And so, he does, and then here's a sort of sprinkling of science, right, that we've known for a long time, criminologists, that juveniles tend to do all their acts. I mean, you guys were kids not a couple years ago, most of you. You do things in groups, right? And so when people are murdered, statistically, we know that they're more likely to happen in groups. Dealio frames this as kids operating in wolf packs, right? So, yes, it's underpinned by some science, but it's sort of exaggerated in a very purposeful way. He does have factual claims based in science that it's true that murder and violence, and I talked about this when we talked about how much crime happened in the U.S., there was these very horrific peaks in the 80s and the early 90s. And I don't think he's alone. I think most social scientists at the time saw that and saw how bad things were, and also saw these echo boomers, right? So the echo boomers are the kids of baby boomers. You have this spike of kids in the population, this giant lump moving through the age group in our country that were going to be in their crime-prone age, and then you had already murders at this historic high, so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to go, all right, things are going to get a lot worse. The irony is that by the time this article was written, crime had already gone down for 2 years, right? So it was already like opposite. But because of these sorts of articles, you had this famous Time magazine article that the headline was something about like crime is the violence and homicide are down. Now for the bad news, the coming ticking time bomb, and so on and so forth. So you just read this article, you can see why Dealio is sort of appealing to media outlets, right? He wrote very provocatively, he uses really colorful language, tells great stories. Yeah, mixed in there is some science. It's true that the 6% of any cohort commits 50% of the crimes, and it's true that had been increasing, but in part because there's more crime. It's not that the kids were getting somehow horrifically worse. It was that crime rates were higher in the 80s and 90s. So this is a great quote sort of at the end of this little section that shows you a great mix of sort of science with ideology and anecdote. Like make contradictory statements back to back. And he says this in the video too, that demography is not fate, chronology is not pure science. How can one be certain that demography, the demographic bulge, that's the echo boomers, of the next 10 years, man, I really need to spell check this, of the next 10 years will unleash an army of young male, this little language is going to unleash an army of young male predatory street criminals who will make even the leaders of the Bloods and the Crips, known as OGs for original gangsters, look tame by comparison. So this part, this demographic bulge part, is absolutely true. And most criminologists saw that coming and predicted that crime would go up. But that's not what his super predator hypothesis is saying. It's not that crime's going to go up. He's actually saying that kids are going to be somehow dramatically, qualitatively different, that they're worse, that you have people afraid of them. They're somehow uniquely soulless, remorseless, godless bastards. Nothing can be done to fix them. They're going to be horrible. It's going to be this bloodbath. And that's the leap that science didn't permit. That none of his claims regarding that stuff is based on any science. It's all just sort of anecdote about cops and prosecutors and people saying, oh, things are a lot worse now, kids are a lot worse now. And in all honesty, most generations make that same argument regardless of the data. So you think about what the public and legislators that hear this message are going to say, and how are they going to respond? So if there's this remorseless, soulless people immune to change coming to get you, you're going to try to take action. So that's sort of the super predator idea, is that there's this sort of new, qualitatively different version of criminal kid coming to get us. Then the question is, well, why? Where do these super predators come from? And his own language basically says, well, it's a conservative theory about the root causes of crime. One is strongly supported by all the best science. So it's worth pointing out here that he talks about it not being pure science and not, credible, but the things that support his argument are science and so on and so forth. So this is a great term conservatives came up with, right? So this is a sort of ideological argument. In the 50s and 60s, liberals were sort of pounding and pounding on this issue that poverty causes crime, economic poverty. And the response and political response was that it wasn't poverty that breeds crime and causes crime, it's moral poverty. And so the argument for conservatives is sort of the opposite of what liberals were making. Conservatives, liberals were saying if you sort of prop up and help support families and give them cash assistance, they can better take care of their kids. Conservatives made the argument that welfare program actually wrecked two-parent families and made things worse, and that poverty doesn't matter. This is moral poverty. Now, the things that they lump under moral poverty, I mean, there's really nothing controversial about most of what he says. That the science is non-controversial. We've known for a long time that severe child abuse, bad parenting, lack of role models, and all that stuff are related to crime. The issue is sort of that poverty has nothing to do with any of those things, right? Well, one of the things we know, just as one example, is that the most severe child abuse happens in cases of the most extreme financial poverty. You have parents that can't make ends meet, that are stressed out, that are living in horrible conditions, that don't know how to parent because they weren't taught. That's the context in child abuse happens. So anyhow, so in here, that's the good example of an interpretive claim. So factual claims, how the world is. His argument is we're going to get inundated by these super predators. Interpretive claim, where do they come from? What do we do? Well, the moral poverty is put forth as this sort of example. The second interpretive claim is that how do we fix moral poverty? And there he puts forth religion. And again, yeah, based partly in science, and in the 90s and into the 2000s, religiosity became one of those things we studied in relation to crime. And there is a correlation between things like church attendance and moral beliefs. But the issue is whether sort of it's cause and effect with religion. If you think about, church attendance, kids who show strong church attendance tend to be insulated from all the bad things in their neighborhood. Is it actually going to church and believing in God, or is it the fact that they probably had parents who forced them to go to church? Most kids don't sort of naturally want to do that. And so untangling the cause and effect is a lot more complicated than D'Elio makes out. And mixed in with his argument is, again, this sort of anecdotal evidence that, the people I talk to all say that religious programs are the ones that worked. After his article and before his sort of change of mind, he was the sort of lead guy for George W. Bush's faith-based program. So there's this sort of movement to try to have government fund programs that attacked alcoholism or crime that were sort of underpinned by religion. The role. What's the role of the media here? You think about how the media is going to treat somebody like John D'Elio versus some more mundane, pointy-headed person like me. Like I said, D'Elio is a great writer. He paints a really vivid picture. He uses all sorts of good analogies and anecdotes and makes these evil super predator. That's a media's dream, right? You can put all the footage behind that. He had a lot of fun quotes to make headlines with in these articles. And it's very easy to link. You think like evil super predator fits with, we'll talk about sort of, what's newsworthy in the media. The media likes sort of senseless, random violence, especially murder. And so in the New York Times video, they talk about these very young kids that committed this brutal gang murder. This famous New York City case where this jogger was raped and murdered, and they initially blamed it and sent to prison these 4 or 5 young kids that were sort of in Central Park and had hassled people during that time. Turns out they didn't actually do it. They were exonerated a few years ago. But it's easy to sort of link to, and it fits pretty well with pre-existing sort of narratives about law and order. And so it fit well with the policymakers in that context of the early 90s and the sort of Get Tough movement we had. And so for that reason, it gained a lot of traction. And it's important that it gained a lot of traction because it was part of what produced this wave of pretty draconian legislation that affected kids. So what do? We increased automatic waiver to adult court. So for certain crimes, if you commit a serious violent crime, and then for maybe the age is 15 and above. So in a lot of states now, if you're 15, 16 years old and you commit aggravated assault, you get waived directly to adult court, which has all sorts of implications. Many places sort of lowered their jurisdiction, so instead of having to be 18 to get to adult court, they lower it to 17 or 16. You have these sort of life without parole. PBS just did a special on sort of the meaning, and the Supreme Court ruled recently that you can't do that to juveniles. So we had this legislation that you think about, like a 15-year-old kid that committed some atrocious murder, life without parole. 15-year-old kid sits in prison for 30 years. As a 45-year-old, are they a danger to society? They need to be in prison. So this super predator idea was one that really sort of helped set that agenda up. And so that's the connection between sort of how we socially construct something and what arguments get media play and how that ends up affecting policy. The MAD one is another great example. Candy Lightner and the organization she started called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. For you guys, one of the big policy issues was the universal 21-year-old drinking age. That was a direct result of this battle. In terms of writing your paper, right? Social constructionism is about, sort of the physical world and competing claims about that, right? So in the physical world, right, people drink, people drive. When they drink and drive, people crash and kill other people. That had happened as long as we had alcohol in vehicles. And so the issue is, how do we think about that? And prior to the 80s, it was thought about like that's a horrible, tragic accident. Police officers used to pull people over when they were drunk and follow them home to their house to make sure they got there safe. It was blamed more on alcohol than it was people. And so the whole sort of MAD take on that was to put forth a very different construction of what drinking and driving was and what it meant and how we should deal with it. And if you read the articles, it fit with that context of the 80s. It sort of turned towards conservatism and free will and all this other stuff. And then you think about the arena in which claims play out, right? The media likes things that are emotional, visual, right? A big part of what MAD did was put parents of kids who got killed because of drunk driving up, or people who lost their whole family. And that sort of testimonial and anecdote tends to be very persuasive and emotional. So if you think about like what MAD did, factual claims. Again, what's a factual claim? It's how the world is, what's happening. To give you one, right? So one of the famous things everybody does for a cause is to say, every X number of seconds somebody dies from this disorder or disease, or in this case, somebody's killed from a drunk driver. The interpretive claim was the key here. It was like, how do we frame this activity? Why does this happen? And the argument was it wasn't because of alcohol, it wasn't because of a disease, it was because of sort of personal individual failure. And MAD in the 80s essentially won out. They sort of won the day and got a lot of policy changes that we're living with today. And the tendency is to make this all sound like bad and evil. It doesn't necessarily mean that, right? It's an example of how sort of MAD constructed this problem in a way to influence policy. Guess what? With the 21-year-old drinking age and a lot of other stuff, alcohol-related fatalities did go down. So it sucks if you're a 19-year-old and you want to drink, but you can sort of debate the policy changes on their own merits. So more long-winded than I wanted, but that gives you some sort of traction to write your papers, and you think about what I'm asking about when I ask about these competing constructions and the types of claims. When I talk about the language of social constructionism, that's what I'm talking about. Factual claims, interpretive claims, what's the actual construction that people make, and so on and so forth. So good luck on the paper, and Thanks for putting up with this extra long video.